And the first speaker is the Rev'd Philip Foster. He is a colleague of mine, a fellow vice chairman of the Campaign for an Independent Britain. He's a scientist as well as a clergyman. He's taught in Africa and been a parish minister here. He's the author of a very interesting book which includes both science and cosmology, entitled While the Earth Endures, and one called EU Reality Check. And he will speak on the costs and consequences of the EU's massively mistaken policies on climate change. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
The first part of my talk, I won't be doing much on slides, but I thought we'd have this as a backdrop of my definition of how the European Union operates: cupidité, stupidité, et rigidité. I'm sorry to any French people around here who have a much more respectable one about the French Revolution, but I felt that that rather sums it up. For the benefit of those who can't translate, it means greed, stupidity, and rigidity. Fairly straightforward. Thinking of, if you say that you don't believe in fairies, and if you say that, then a fairy dies. There was a lovely Matt cartoon a few days ago of a Tory canvasser at a door saying to a prospective voter, "If you vote for UKIP, all the bees will die." Which I thought rather summed it up rather well in circumstances. And this is just a brief report about how the European Union sees itself. It has set up what I think it's called the Museum of European History at our expense. And it has a large number of sort of academics. And somebody I met the other day who is a research fellow of history, Lucy Cavendish, in Cambridge, said she went to a lecture given by the head of this glorious institution. And amongst one of the many intriguing things that she learnt is that your fathers and grandfathers fought apparently in 1939 to 45 in something described as the European Civil War. I kid you not, that is the official EU version of World War II. I don't know what the Americans think of it. Perhaps they weren't asked. Well, my theme, as Edward has said, I've called it, is the EU green with envy? And I mean green, of course, what I mean by environmentally, what have you, and all this obsession with climate change. One of the puzzles that always surprises me is why it is that big corporations, both in Britain and Europe, seem so keen on the European Union. And the answer to that is fairly straightforward. Big corporations are not competitive. One of the things they like is heavy regulation and centralized markets that are equally heavily regulated. The reason for this, of course, is that, and I say this with a grand sense of generality, most corporations are essentially idle. They don't want to work. They want to sit back and simply live on the benefits of their grand corporations. Their main problem is competition. In a true free market, this would kill off the big corporations quite quickly, just as it kills off nationalized state industries. There's not much difference between the two. But heavy regulation, which the EU provides in abundance, actually makes it very difficult for entrepreneurial, nimble, and capable competitors from actually ousting the big corporations. So that's why they love the European Union. But unfortunately, if you build walls around yourself of regulations like that and live on the fat of the land, as it were, which is what most of them like to do, there has come a big problem. You may indeed be able to make a ring fence around Europe, as the European Union loves to do, because remember, it's not a free market, it is a customs barrier system. What happens when the world outside your little walled garden suddenly becomes far more competitive than you are, which we know is already the case? Regulation kills competition within the European Union, but the trouble is, what happens when competition comes from outside? And this was the problem the European Union faced, as indeed I think the wider Western world to some degree faced, but the European Union in particular. How to stop that competition coming from what we call the BRICS, from places like China and India and South America, and even to some degree now from Africa, which is competing successfully against the rigidity of the European Union. Well, they tried tariff barriers. But as it happens, GATT trading activities are reducing these tariff barriers. So it's becoming more difficult to keep these better quality goods, yes they are very often, out of the European Union by that method. They needed another weapon to keep out, or at least, were better still, to neuter this competition from the BRICS. How could it be done? And here we come to the green issue, because this is the tool the European Union uses to quench competition and, if possible, to stifle it. If there is one vital ingredient to real development in the developing world, such as Africa, China, India, and South America, the one key ingredient to make it happen is energy. Useful, viable, available energy. The European Union argues that if that can be stifled, if that can be reduced, their development rate can also be reduced. And of course they started using the same strategy, massive regulation. In this they were in cahoots with the United Nations and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I have enormous regard for Mrs. Thatcher, that one of the mistakes she did make, which she regretted and says so in her autobiography herself much later, was the setting up in effect of the IPCC. She thought it would leapfrog Europe. Europe actually saw that as a tool for their own manipulation. So the European Union is using climate issues, green issues, to stifle the third world. Well, that's what they think they are trying to do. The good news is, ladies and gentlemen, is that they have utterly failed. China, India, South America, for that matter, to a lesser degree Africa, are not playing ball with this Western strange belief in the issues of environmentalism. Oddly, tragically, this country is perhaps the worst culprit in, as it were, committing a kind of economic suicide. In 2008, as I'm sure you are aware, the Climate Change Act was passed in October, a little bit down the road, by a majority of everybody, say 4 MPs, in October during a snowstorm. Why? Why could 600 members of the House of Commons be so bamboozled into believing that there was a problem with the climate? Well, most of you here, I'm sure, could probably fill me in as well as I will try to do for anybody who doesn't know, but I'll do that a little later. But the Green Agenda, incidentally, it was Friends of the Earth who wrote that act. They wrote it, and the Labour government passed it, and the Conservatives all agreed with it, for the most part. That was the Friends of the Earth writing the agenda, just as whatever it is hacked off is writing the anti-freedom of the press regulation. Why does the government listen to these people? Well, you must ask them. Anyway, the focus of the Act and the focus of this pressure from the European Union is on this obsessive belief in man-made global warming or climate change. I'm tempted to say, why man-made? Don't women contribute? Sorry. Maybe there's a hint of pseudo-religious Earth Mother worship lying behind this. I don't think it's a totally absurd idea. But why did it obsess the intellects, if that's what they're called, of Europe, this belief that we are changing the world for the worse, that we must tread lightly upon this earth, we must be wary of our carbon footprint, and so on. Britain, too, seems to suffer from this. Why is it there? Well, as a clergyman and as a Christian, I would say, interestingly, that when God is rejected, it's amazing how human thinking becomes split. On the one hand, cold scientific reason. On the other hand, a strange, unreasonable will energized by a belief in nature. Both take the high ground and engage in an almost schizophrenic kind of argument. I want to go back in history. In 1762, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote Émile, and in it contains these lines: "One half of the children who are born die before their 8th year. That is nature's law. Why contradict it?" That is a philosophy that lurks amongst the intellects, or so-called intellects and academias, in a large part of Europe. This is a cold, old Malthusian philosophy. Malthus, who sadly was a fellow clergyman many years ago, did a mathematical calculation. He claimed that the human race is going to starve itself to death, that if the population rose beyond 400 million, we would all die of starvation. Well, it's 7 billion, Mr. Malthus, though he has been dead a few years, and we're not starving. But behind Malthus is this Jacques Rousseau type of philosophy: nature, blind and uncaring, rules, and to break her laws will bring retribution. And to follow her logic is an act of will. But the trouble is, if you believe that kind of thing, it leads to terrible acts of human cruelty. The terror in France needs no mention. The many other terrors in Russia and Europe that continued after it are there in the history books. The terrors that Nazi Germany introduced lie with this nature worship behind it. If you worship nature as a goddess, before long you will worship nature as the devil. In Germany, and again this is not a generalized, this is about the academia, they manage this rationalism and this obsession with nature running side by side. Their worship of Mother Nature led actually to genocide on probably the world's most horrendous scale. If those of you who like Wagner, and I confess, and to my shame I sometimes do, his ring cycle is a kind of obsession with the mother goddess, Erde, who rules over all, cold and implacable. To disobey her is to bring Gotterdammerung down on the human race, as indeed happens, despite Siegfried's Volkishness and his love of nature, apparently. Nature worship brings with it deep pessimism, and it includes a vision of utter hopelessness and fatalism. Yet, the Industrial Revolution changed that. I know we're taught to think it was a terrible thing, and indeed there was much that was wrong. But one of the wonderful things the Industrial Revolution did, strange though it may seem, was to raise the condition of the working classes. They flocked into the cities, not because they had no work in the countryside, but work in the countryside was terrible. And work in the cities seemed at least better. And indeed, they did, in theory, become somewhat richer. The trouble is, the modern day Greens are like the Malthusians and Rousseau. They don't really care about human life. They often speak, and you will hear them speak, saying they care about the children and our children's children. But actually, they want us to return to a world where many children won't survive childhood. I owe that to Donna Lampron once, incidentally. Google her, she's well worth reading. So, behind what we see today are these dark hosts of goddess worship, earth worship, and all this kind of ghastly irrationalism. So with this background, we can see why Brussels, the elite, took the possibilities of greenery, I use that word to generalize, to heart as a tool to manipulate the world markets. Because it would seem to chime with what the people think. And it could stave off and perhaps castrate the industrial might of the BRIC countries in their emergence from their developing. Sadly, once again, I must mention, and I have, as I said, deep respect for Margaret Thatcher. In her fight with the then powerful National Union of Mine Workers, she took the advice of two men, both of whom proved totally unworthy of her trust. One was Sir Crispin Tickell, the other was Sir John Houghton. The former, a modern Malthusian, who said that human beings are like caterpillars, they eat everything and they must be stopped. The latter, Christian, I'm no judge of him, the Lord will judge him, but increasingly diverted towards a devotion towards earth first attitudes, having been a civil servant and head of the Met Office. Both persuaded her of the danger of industrial burning of fossil fuels and the consequence of global warming. She could see its use against the miners. Am I actually still working? No, I should have stopped. Have I turned myself off? The sound moved. Okay, on. How's that? Yes, back again. Sorry about that. She could see its use against the miners. Claimed that coal was bad, nuclear power was good, we must close down the pits, though she didn't close as many as Harold Wilson did. Aware too that the EU, and she was aware of this, was waking up to the possibilities of global warming as a means of control, she pushed ahead and set up the Hadley Centre, associated with the Met Office, with its computer-generated so-called weather patterns, and initiated the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, with, how convenient, Sir John Houghton as its chief scientist. Later she repented of this error, but sadly too late. As she says in her autobiography, the doomster's favourite subject today is climate change. This has a number of attractions for them. First, the science is extremely obscure, so they cannot easily be proved wrong. Second, we all have ideas about the weather. Traditionally, the English, on first acquaintance, talk of little else. Third, since clearly no plan to alter climate could be considered on anything but a global scale, it provides a marvellous excuse for worldwide supranational socialism. All this suggests a degree of calculation, yet perhaps that is to miss half the point. Rather, as it was said of Hamlet, that there was a method in his madness, so one feels that in the case of some of the gloomier alarmists, there is a large amount of madness in their method. And that's good old Margaret, well put, as I would strongly say. The result of climate conferences set up by the IPCC was simply the EU's attempt to smother development in developing countries. Relatively successful in Africa, a divided continent, but to no avail for the BRICS, who weren't that stupid. COP15 in 2009, which we attended in a counter-conference in 2009, was the end of the road. Incidentally, the chairman or chairwoman of that, a lady from Denmark called Connie Hedegaard, was, from the point of view of everyone, a useless chairperson. She resigned, and wonder of wonders, is now the EU Commissioner for Climate Action. It's jobs for them. Yet the EU had signed up to huge carbon-cutting targets. The UK, in order to be a spaniel to the EU, to say how good we are, signed up to an 80% cut by 2015. Absurd. As I've said, only 4 MPs voted against it. And they're good sound MPs. They're mostly Conservatives, so vote for them. I'll tell you who they, if I can remember who they all are afterwards. Well, one of them is Peter Lilly. All that now remains, though, after COP15 in 2009, the whole thing fell apart. The BBC didn't tell you that, because they didn't want you to know. But COP15 was the end of the road for this climate caper. It killed it dead, because quite sensibly China and India and so on were not interested in cutting fossil fuel emissions. But the trouble is, there is a huge amount of detritus left. I would say this, and I'll talk briefly if time permits on the scientific side of it. The science argument over, quote, climate change, unquote, is one. There is no scientific basis for any of it, and if anyone wants to talk to me about that afterwards, please do. There is no basis for it. The economic argument from a theoretical point of view is one. The Stern report is complete rubbish. I would use a stronger word, but I'm a clergyman. And is dismissed by any economist who knows anything about economics. I won't go into the details. Better, more qualified people than I will speak afterwards, and they know more than I do. The trouble is, the snouts in the trough have not been dealt with. There is huge money, pseudo-money, riding on this. Huge money. Already, the Western world and European Union and Britain and America have spent $60 billion on research alone into proving climate change. No science proves anything. Science is about testing a hypothesis. That hypothesis, if I have time for it, has failed. No scientist should ever say, I will prove something for you. The Royal Society did when Mrs. Thatcher asked them to, which is why the Royal Society, in that regard, has prostituted its science credentials. The Royal Society has failed and should be disbanded. It is not a scientific society, it is a political pressure group. So, it has failed in all respects. The carbon market, this great scam which was set up by America, parts of America and the European Union, has flopped. I quote from the American Interest blog by Walter Russell Reed, the EU has been the global laboratory testing the green agenda to see how it works. Today's story, the total collapse of the carbon market, means that the guinea pig died. The most important piece of green intervention in the world history has become an expensive and embarrassing flop. It is hard to exaggerate the importance of this for our environmentalists everywhere. If the EU can't make the green agenda work, it's unlikely anybody else will even give it a try. Well spoken. But still we have the detritus of this disastrous policy. The wind farms, the biofuels, even the solar panels, all ruinous to poorer people. Every solar panel, dare I say it, if you put it up on your house, is taking money from your neighbour for nothing. Taking it out of his bank account for nothing. The EU's good at that. It likes doing that. But I find it rather difficult when my neighbour says, oh, I'm going to put up a solar panel. I say, fine, you want to steal from your neighbours, that's all right, I suppose, by me, but I wouldn't do it. That's what it is. Wind farms, far worse. We don't need to go into that. As a result of the increase by 10, 20, 30% a year of our fuel bills, and they will go on increasing if this carries on, by that amount every year. Poor people are dying of cold. 6,000, Richard North has already produced this figure, and I thank him for this figure. 6,000 extra deaths were registered in February and March as a result of fuel poverty. Just in that period. 26,000 people die needlessly every year because of fuel poverty. DEC should be prosecuted for corporate manslaughter. It is disgraceful what they are doing. However, I don't suppose they will be, but it's worth a try. I'm going to move quickly on now to just, how am I doing? 5 minutes? 5 minutes we will do. But 10, well, you better not say that, it's fatal. Okay, I'm going to run through some quick science, in case you are not convinced that science is now proven the other way. Think back when you were born 600 million years ago, which I'm sure you do remember, and this is a temperature versus CO2 graph. Roughly speaking, it's based on fossil deposits and so forth. CO2 levels and temperature in green do not relate. Period. Secondly, notice where we are now. Here. That's where we are. The CO2 levels relative to the history of the Earth for the last 600 million years is incredibly low. We are on starvation rations of CO2. The last time it was this low was 300 million years ago. Why are they fussing about an increase from a dangerously low amount of CO2? CO2, let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, creates you and me. You are made of carbon dioxide. You eat what is made from carbon dioxide. That is what is the life-giving gas on this planet, and there's not much of it. Oxygen, yes, we need that to live because we happen to be sentient beings. We have to be animals. Plants don't desperately, they probably need a bit, but they don't really need it. It's a poison gas for most early organisms. When coal, which I keep in a plastic bag because it's a bit mucky, is burnt, what it produces is wheat. There you are. That's what grows in our fields because we have burnt this. Remember that when they tell you CO2 is a poisonous gas. Burning coal makes bread. 1 ton of aviation fuel generates 1,500 loaves of bread. As the planet's population increases, and I'm pleased about that, I like people. Dare I say it, as a clergyman I will say so. God has arranged this planet that as more people live, more CO2 is generated and more food grows. Fairly straightforward arrangement. Now, spinning on, the last 6 billion years, temperatures have been going up apparently. Oh dear, no, they've been going down. They're continually going down. Yes, there are spikes up and down, but basically the general trend on planet Earth is going down. The last 20,000 years, since the last ice age, that was when there was ice a mile high, not very far from here, sitting over everything. A lovely time to live, if you happen to live in Britain. It's got warmer, I am very pleased to say. And for the last 10 to 15,000 years, it has been pleasantly warmer. Ups and downs, maybe. The Roman warm period, very important for the expansion of the Roman Empire. Viticulture moved north, the growing of vines moved from Yorkshire even into southern Scotland. It was that warm. Then it had the Little Ice Age, which was very cold and most unpleasant. Plague, famine, death, followed by a more recent, in the last 150 years, a slight rise. This is from the Greenland ice cores. So, on the whole, we're not that much warmer than right at the beginning of this. And yet they're worried about it. Warming causes prosperity. Cold causes disease, death, and misery. Fortunately today, with better technology, better farming, things are better if it gets colder. And it is probably going to get colder. I'm not a prophet, or the son of a prophet, but the general prediction from those who understand the way the sun is behaving is that we may be going back to a little ice age. There has been no rise in temperature for the last 70 years, by the way, and it's probably trending down. This was the famous hockey stick that claimed that temperatures have shot up in the last 100 years, based on fallacious and mendacious so-called science. You read about the story of that, Hiding the Decline, in Andrew Montford's excellent book on Climate Gate and the hockey stick. That's there. Right, moving on. The reality of what's happened in the last 1,000 years was the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age, which followed it, and a slight rise. We're no longer anything like as warm as the medieval warm period, where there was vineyards in Yorkshire. Tell me, anybody got a vineyard in Yorkshire? Yorkshire wine, anybody? No, it's not that warm. That's the last 130 years or so, which is much quoted. In fact, it was probably warmer in the 30s than it is now, with the properly adjusted figures. That looks quite dramatic, all that jagged and exciting temperature change. But actually, the change is only about 0.7 of a degree overall. What does that mean? Well, if you look at it in terms of daily temperature fluctuations, that's what that same graph would look like. It's meaningless. Global temperatures are almost a meaningless statement. Not quite, but almost. Here are two 50-year periods. I owe this to Professor Richard Lindzen. Incidentally, I've got a pamphlet of his talk at the House of Commons on it there. If you want to get it afterwards, I'll charge you for it, of course. He chose two 50-year periods showing temperature rise over time. Identical length of time, identical scale, and he asked the nice question, can you tell me which is man-made and which is natural? I can't. I don't know the answer. There's no difference. I mean, things just change up and down. Currently, since 1997, temperatures have flatlined, and as I suspect, but cannot prove, it's going to be likely to go down, not up. Right. The Hadley Centre and computer models. This was the big deal. The computer models predict we're all going to fry. Now, this is a bit technical. Very simply speaking, from 75 degrees north to 75 degrees south, going up in the atmosphere, according to the models, CO2 should cause a warm area in the troposphere above the tropics. That's what the computer models predict. A lovely, pretty picture. And that appeared in the IPCC Chapter 1 on the drama of climate change. Tucked away in Chapter 5, which they didn't think anyone would reach, is actual measurements. A totally different picture. Let me just go back. That's the computer model. That's the actual measurements for the same period. If anything, there is a cool patch over the tropics. In other words, the computer models are completely wrong because they're based on the belief of carbon dioxide causing warming, which it almost certainly does not. Here is more ground stations and satellite temperature changes as measured, as opposed to the IPCC predictions, which of course go up off the scale. The green is satellite, always lower than Earth temperatures, probably the more reliable anyway, but that's by the by. Then you get the idiots. Dr. David Viner, described as a senior research fellow at the Climatic Research Unit at UEA, our children are just not going to know what snow is. Well, there you go, 2000. Here's a nice one. How come we never get invited to these extreme weather events? Incidentally, extreme weather, not that there's been much evidence of it, as I shall come to, but extreme weather is evidence of a cooling planet, not a warming planet. This is a fundamental fact of meteorology. A cooling planet means the poles get colder than the tropics. The tropics tend to stay the same but get wetter or drier. As the planet warms, that temperature difference reduces. Reduced temperature difference means less storminess overall. Yeah, okay, just spin on. That's actually that. I'll move on to those. Okay, just quickly, we're heading, in principle, for another ice age. And I mean possibly another big one, not a small one. Wind turbines, bird processors, 600 bird deaths per turbine per year, some of them rare species, and as Delingpole beautifully calls them, eco-crucifixes. I'm going to spin through the pointlessness of wind turbines. Even on their own standards, they're useless. Here is a wind map of Europe. They always tell you the wind will blow somewhere, so we'll be all right. That was a wind map of Europe. Blue and blue means no wind. That's the whole of Europe. No wind. So we can't rely on wind, even if it were viable, which it is not. Smart meters, that's the latest thing. That's to give you power cuts and take the power from you and give it to somebody else. Actually, what it's about is taking money from poor people and giving it to rich people. Peak oil, there is no such thing. We are not running out of fossil fuels. We will not run out of fossil fuels. The likelihood is, if the Lord does not return, that's a different issue, that there is fossil fuels on this country for the next 1 million years. Plenty. We're sitting on it. 1,500 years of gas are under our feet as we speak. And we can have it now. I'm going to spin through the reason why I think that. It's in your handout. Shale gas is possibly not the magic solution, but it's a solution. It's perfectly safe. That's the shale deposits in Britain. According to the Geological Survey, it's not my figures, that's theirs. Just think about it. When it comes to it, which would you prefer? A shale gas well cap, which is what that is, pumping gas out, clean, efficient, reliable, and virtually unlimited, or one of those, hideous, noisy, expensive, unreliable, and extremely limited in what it can produce. The choice is yours. The European Union says you should have that. I think I would prefer that. That's hidden, that's an air view. If you look at it from ground level, you can't even see it. It's hidden by the trees. We need energy for development. The whole world needs energy for development. The EU is trying to stop that, to crush economic opposition. It is dying, and it wants to kill everybody else with it. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. I have to say that from my own experience in the grain trade, I remember a time in the early 70s when it was predicted that we were going to be getting an ice age because of all the emissions from factory chimneys. And some of the people who were keenest to freezers then are the keenest to roasters now. Also, I remember visiting greenhouses where they fed the carbon dioxide from furnaces into the greenhouses to improve yields by as much as 40%. So one Russian scientist described CO2 as bread for plants. So it's nice to be frightened.